Lutherans first came to America as a trickle of early Dutch and Swedish colonists in the 17th century. In time, the trickle turned into a rushing river of German and Scandinavian immigrants. By the 19th century, the river had become a human flood from many parts of Europe. The story of Lutherans in America is the story of America itself. During Martin Luther's lifetime, many leaders in Northern Europe joined the Protestant movement. In the decades after his death in 1546, the entire European continent was thrown into a series of bloody civil wars. Germany was often the battleground. When the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, Europe was exhausted. Disease and starvation were everywhere. Many peasants packed up and left Europe for a new world, one that held out the promise of hope, America. Hello, welcome to MOSAIC, the video magazine of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm Lowell Allman, Secretary of the ELCA. For the next half hour, we're going to explore stories of the first Lutherans in America, including those who formed this congregation at Trapp, Pennsylvania. By understanding who those Lutheran immigrants were, why they came, and what they found when they got here, we can better understand who we are as Lutherans today. Following Christopher Columbus's voyage of discovery in 1492, European nations with the biggest navies grabbed territory as fast as they could. Roman Catholic Spain and Portugal conquered, then settled parts of the Caribbean, as well as Central and South America. Europe's other powerhouses, Sweden, Denmark, France, and England, set their sights on the east coast of North America. The first Lutherans in America came from Holland. Some may have arrived as early as 1623. They were part of the Dutch West India Company, a trading enterprise backed by a government in Amsterdam. They settled on the island of Manhattan and founded the city of New Amsterdam. Today we call it New York. Most of those colonists were Reformed Protestant. They looked to John Calvin, not Martin Luther. Because the Reformed Church was the official church of New Amsterdam, Lutherans there were barely tolerated. But after the English took control of the colony in 1664 and renamed it New York, Lutherans gained religious liberty. They were able to establish congregations there and elsewhere in what was called the New World. One of the early colonial legacies that is still with us today can be found in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1666, Frederick Lutheran Church on the island of St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies was founded by the Church of Denmark. Today, Frederick Lutheran Church is the second oldest congregation in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. It is also the oldest Christian congregation in the Western Hemisphere, with members of African descent. About the time that the Dutch were establishing their colony on Manhattan, Christina, the daughter of the late King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, started a colony in the Delaware River Valley. The colony was located near what is now known as Wilmington, Delaware. This monument marks the spot of that first permanent settlement near the Delaware River.
Always the colonists were looking for waterways. And if you look down the East Coast, you'll see wherever there was a waterway, whether it was the Hudson River or Chesapeake Bay, even down in the South, it was the waterways that attracted people for those early port cities.
Those Swedish immigrants to the Delaware Valley came on a ship like this. They arrived on the Kelmer Nickel, a sailing ship of the Royal Swedish Navy, in March 1638.
So the Swedes came in and they had a kind of package deal. The Swedish government set up a colony in a very orderly way. They would have a governor, they would have a garrison, they would have a chaplain, and then they would have the kinds of crafts that you needed to maintain a garrison and then to start planting crops and building up a settlement.
In the 17th century, if your king was a Lutheran, you most likely were a Lutheran too. So it was that the Swedish Lutherans sought to establish Lutheran congregations in their New World colony. One of the first was Holy Trinity, known today as Old Swedes Church. Both the Dutch and Swedish colonies on the Atlantic seaboard were successful. Unfortunately for them, the English had a more powerful navy than the navies of Sweden or Holland.
The Swedes decided they weren't going to send any more pastors over here, or actually missionaries as they called them, because they figured this was a little mission church that they had way over here. And they were having financial problems, and there were wars going on, and so they decided not to send any more missionaries over here.
The Dutch decided that the Swedes were weak, and they moved in on the Swedish colonies, took them over. Then the English discovered that the Dutch were weak, and so the English took over the whole coastline. And what had been originally Dutch or Swedish colonies now all became a part of the British Empire.
While some of the colonial churches were formed by Swedish or Dutch or German Lutherans, a few of those historic churches eventually became Episcopalian. The primary reason was the desire of members for English-speaking priests. Old Swedes Church came under Episcopal jurisdiction in 1791. This historic church building, constructed originally by Lutherans more than 300 years ago in 1698, is still in use today. This pulpit of Old Swedes Church is the oldest pulpit in use in the United States. It was constructed of wood given by members of the congregation. The walnut was provided by Peter Peterson, 3 boards, Lucas Stenham, 1 board, Osman, 2 sticks, Brewer Seneca, 1 log, Eric of Cranehook, 7 boards. An ironic footnote to the early Swedish period is Justice Faulkner. He is the first Lutheran to be ordained in colonial America. A German layman with theological training, Faulkner was selling real estate for William Penn near Germantown. When a Dutch congregation in New York asked him to be their pastor, he agreed and was ordained by a group of Swedish clergy in 1703. Pastor Faulkner was committed to serve all people, not only Dutch or German immigrants. After baptizing a black infant, he wrote, "O Lord, merciful God, who regardest not the person of men, but with whom in every nation he that feareth thee and worketh righteousness is accepted. Let this child be and remain clothed in the robe of righteousness through Jesus Christ, the Savior and Redeemer of all. Amen." The first really big German migration to the English colonies began in the early 1700s and continued throughout much of the 18th century.
The Germans simply moved up anywhere they could find land. These were poor people, mostly farmers, from the areas in Germany that had been torn by war to the degree that there was no future for people to stay on the land. And so they looked for new land. They came to this country, now a British colony, and discovered that all the good land, all the good coastal territory was already taken. The Quakers and the other English were in the Philadelphia area. So the Germans had to move farther inland. They became the buffer between the colonies and the Native American, the Indian tribes that were all up and down the coast.
One of the most famous German migrations to America involved a group known as the Salzburgers. It was the dead of winter, 1731. Archbishop Leopold Anton von Firmian of Salzburg decided to end decades of religious division by declaring that everyone in Salzburg had to be Roman Catholic. The alternative? Leave. He declared, "I would rather have thorns and thistles on my fields than Protestants in my land." So the Archbishop forced nearly 30,000 Lutherans to take only what they could carry and hit the road. One group sailed for America. General James Edward Oglethorpe, a member of the English Parliament, had recently started a colony in Georgia. Oglethorpe was looking for colonists. On March 12, 1734, the first of 4 ships arrived in Savannah and founded the town of Ebenezer, 25 miles to the north. Those who survived the first 2 winters moved the group to a site on the Savannah River, along with their church building and Sunday school. Jerusalem Evangelical Lutheran Church is still an active congregation. Many of the modern members of Jerusalem bear the names of their colonial ancestors. Eight years later, in the fall of 1742, a 31-year-old pastor from Germany arrived at the port of Charleston. His name was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. He stopped briefly at the Salzburger Ebenezer settlement near Savannah. Then he proceeded to Pennsylvania to serve congregations in the Philadelphia area.
We have in Henry Melchior Muhlenberg someone who was a pioneer, someone who was deeply concerned to go to this new world and to extend Lutheranism in ways that would be salutary and that would continue to extend the ministry of the church to those who had taken flight or who had decided to cast their lot in the new world.
November 25th, 1742. This morning about 8 o'clock we arrived at Philadelphia. So far the Lord hath helped. I'm a stranger in Philadelphia and do not know which way to turn.
When Muhlenberg arrived in colonial America, there were scattered Lutheran congregations, but there was no organized Lutheran church. Unlike the English, Spanish, French, Swedish, or Dutch immigrants, Germans didn't stick together in colonies. In many cases, they simply made their way to Charleston, New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, and then disappeared into the wilderness looking for land. Muhlenberg's job was to gather the flock.
These people were so hungry for religious leadership and instruction that they would turn to anybody that had a little learning or pretended to have a little learning. In fact, they got to be called pretenders for this reason. Some fellow would come into a community and he'd say, I'm a Lutheran pastor. Because if you were a pastor, they would provide you with some housing usually, or they would at least pay you for doing baptisms and marriages. So you could make a little money that way. So these fellows would say, I'm a Lutheran pastor, and they say, well, can you prove it? No, coming over on the ship, great wave, blew all of our belongings overboard, so my ordination papers disappeared. Trust me. Well, that was a very bad move. And when Muhlenberg came, he came as a missionary because the folks in Germany began to realize that there were a lot of Germans here who needed religious help.
November 28th, 1742. About 9 o'clock, I rode with the deacon to the church, which is located in the center of New Hanover. The so-called preacher, Schmidt, came and sat down beside me on a chair. I told him that I intended to preach my inaugural sermon and relieve him.
And so Muhlenberg came to try to make some sense and order out of this religious fervor and ferment and chicanery that was going on. His goal was to set up a structure that would validate pastors, so that if you got a pastor who was properly prepared, you would know it. And so he set up the synod, which was a structure really to credential clergy.
For 45 years, Henry Melchior Muhlenberg served immigrants to the New World. His daily diaries provide a priceless historical treasure. Each entry offers a window into the early life of the Lutheran Church in America.
I preached at New Hanover to a large assembly. I made 2 announcements to the congregation. They were not to pay anything when they had their children baptized. And also, at the Lord's Supper, there was to be no offering of money at the altar for the pastor.
Henry Melchior Muhlenberg has been called the patriarch of Lutheranism in North America. And it was really Muhlenberg who organized Lutherans into what was the first significant Lutheran organization in North America.
After Henry Melchior Muhlenberg died on October 7th, 1787, a marble slab was placed on his grave that bears the statement, "Who and what he was, future ages will know without a stone." And so we do because of his untiring witness to the gospel and his diligent efforts to plant the Lutheran Church in what for immigrants was a new land. Pastor Muhlenberg's favorite motto was the Latin phrase Ecclesia plantanda, which means the church must be planted. At the time of Muhlenberg's death, Lutheran congregations were growing as fast as the population of the new nation of the United States of America, and they were learning to work together too. Isolated congregations began to group together in synods. Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Maryland, Virginia, and Tennessee were among the first. Later synods included such names as Augustana, Chicago, Texas, Buffalo, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, Michigan, Nebraska, Iowa, and many others. Some of the earliest congregations and new church buildings sprang up in such places as Winchester, Virginia, Craigorstown, Maryland, Emmitsburg, Pennsylvania, and Albany, New York. Founded in 1649, First Lutheran Church in Albany is actually the ELCA's oldest active congregation. A series of handmade windows inside the sanctuary tell the story of the gospel and Lutherans in America. As the new synods grew, they also experienced growing pains. In the 1800s, language and ethnicity both unified and divided Lutherans. As descendants of early German, Danish, and Swedish Lutheran immigrant groups adapted to the customs and language of their English neighbors, newer immigrant groups wanted to worship in their native tongue. Congregations were forced to offer services in two languages to accommodate two different groups. Things turned ugly at St. Michael's in Philadelphia. Revolutionary War hero Peter Muhlenberg, the son of Henry and Anna Muhlenberg, led a group who sought to have an English-speaking pastor called to serve alongside the two German-speaking pastors in that congregation. When the German majority overruled the English minority, the congregation split. While urban population centers fought over which language they would worship in, newly formed synods struggled to supply pastors for rural frontier congregations. Lutheran immigrants now pouring into the Ohio Valley and beyond were hungry for land. The church had to catch up.
Well, there were basically two large waves of immigrations of Germans to America, kind of a first early wave, and then in the 19th century you actually had, during that period of time, 5 million Germans coming to America, 600,000 over a period of about 30 years alone. A lot of Germans who came, particularly in the earlier years, from Scandinavian countries and also from Germany, came for economic reasons, to try to get ahead in life because they recognized the New World offered a lot more opportunity that way.
In response to the need for more trained pastors, the General Synod, a federation of several geographic synods, established the Gettysburg Theological Seminary under the direction of Samuel Schmucker in 1826. Later, in 1864, the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia was started and served as the seminary of the General Council. Because the need for seminary training was so acute on the American frontier, Lutheran seminaries like the one at Gettysburg drew many non-Lutheran students. One example is Daniel Alexander Payne. Payne went on to become the 6th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and founder of Wilberforce University. The 1800s saw the arrival of vast numbers of immigrants, thousands of Germans each year, plus throngs of Scandinavian immigrants who profoundly shaped the future of Lutheranism in America.
When the Norwegian immigrants came to this country, most of them Lutheran, of course, they brought their Bible, their hymn book, and their catechism. And the immigrant trunks were full of those things. They first came to Fox River in Illinois, and then they started moving up to Muskego Then they went to Decorah, and then they came up to Minnesota and Dakota from there. Immigration scholars talk about push-pull factors. The push was the fact that in the 1830s and 40s, as they started to hear about America and really come over here in numbers, they were starving to death. There were too many children in the family, and Norway had a system of primogeniture, which meant that the oldest son received the farm. Then the rest of them just had to make do. So there was a huge population explosion at that time. But the pull, of course, was then free land. And that hunger for land that the peasant has all over the world is just amazing. And it just pulled him like a magnet right to the Midwest.
The 1700s and 1800s saw the growth of a new, primarily lay-led religious movement in Europe. First centered in Halle, Germany, the movement quickly spread to Norway and elsewhere. It was known as Pietism. Pietism influenced the lives of many immigrant Lutherans, including Pastor Muhlenberg and the early members of this congregation at Trapp.
Neilson Hauge was a farmer's boy from eastern Norway who was searching for more religious meaning in his life. And one day, April 6, 1796, he was out plowing his fields, and he was hit by a light from heaven, and it totally changed him. He was semi-conscious. He couldn't quite understand what had happened to him, but he felt, as he said, a thirst for God, a thirst for scriptures, and a thirst to tell others about Jesus Christ.
Hans Neilson Hauge went on to lead a lay movement that swept across Norway. Haugean Pietism deeply shaped the lives of many Norwegian immigrants to America.
Worship in these early congregations in this country would have been from the first based on the liturgy of the Church of Norway. They all required that their pastors use the liturgy of the Church of Norway. But the interesting thing was it was hymn-based, so they sang many hymns during service. The first thing they got here, they realized that they needed to build churches, so they built churches before they built their own homes, and they gave absolutely half of what they had. I mean, you read the gifts that they gave so they could have a church. And then they called pastors that they had prepared.
Among the first Lutheran pastors for Norwegians in the upper Midwest was a Danish immigrant teacher named Claus Lauritz Clausen. He was ordained on October 18, 1843 to serve the Muskego Church southwest of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. Immigrants also established seminaries, church colleges, hospitals, and social service institutions. A confusing point for many Lutherans and non-Lutherans alike is the existence of two major Lutheran church bodies in the United States, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. To understand the Missouri Synod and its distinctive history, we need to recall the trek of a group of Saxons to Perry County, Missouri.
The Saxons came because in their part of Germany, controlled by the Prussian king, things had gotten so bad, in their opinion, that they could no longer practice their faith. The Prussian king had ordered in 1817 that the Reformed Church and the Lutheran Church were supposed to come together. And in the year 1834, he actually ordered the use of one worship service alone. Unfortunately, that worship service denied some key Lutheran doctrines.
About this time, Martin Stephan, a charismatic pastor from Dresden, began to gather a following of like-minded Lutherans. Among them was a young pastor, C.F.W. Walther.
As a young man, he was raised in an era of rationalism, and when he went to church, he heard sermons sometimes that preached about how to plant better potatoes. Things had gotten so bad in Germany under rationalism that the preachers had almost forgotten about the gospel. And he went through some great personal trials and struggles, and he was attracted to a German pastor named Martin Stephan in the city of Dresden, and many other Lutherans were as well.
In 1839, Stephan and 750 followers pooled their money and bought passage on 5 ships bound for New Orleans. While crossing the Atlantic, one of the ships, the Amelie, went down, drowning all aboard. The surviving pilgrims arrived in New Orleans, boarded steamships, and made their way up the Mississippi to St. Louis in search of a new home.
They sent scouts up into Iowa, which of course is the richest farmland in the world, but they came back and said, this is no good for farming because there are no trees. In those days, they thought the only land good for farming was land that could produce trees.
Rather than settle on the prairie, Saxon scouts staked out land 100 miles south of St. Louis in Perry County, Missouri. After establishing a settlement near the Mississippi, sickness, hunger, and disturbing revelations about their leader rocked the group.
Unfortunately, the very sad story of the Saxon immigration is that shortly after coming to this country, and even while on the ship, Martin Stephan started to insist, you know, I am the leader, I am the bishop, and I want you all to sign your loyalty to me. Promise to be loyal to me as your bishop. And when he got to America, he lived rather high on the hog. He found a nice house for himself, and he insisted on really fine clothing and the best of accommodations and food and drink, while the other people were languishing, literally in some cases, dying from hunger and sickness. And then what really brought it to a head was some indiscretion on the part of Martin Stephan. He literally was sent packing across the river.
Finally, Walther and other Saxon leaders confronted Stephan. In the end, Stephan was taken down to the river with a boat and a few belongings. The Saxons told him never to return. Following the Stephan debacle, CFW Walther and other leaders pulled the group together. Some folk didn't survive that first winter. Others returned to Germany. But those who stayed built homes, churches, schools, and even a seminary. In 1847, Walther's group organized themselves along with other German Lutherans in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, forming what would eventually become the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
People love to understand their own personal history because it helps them place themselves in life right here and now. It gives them a sense of perspective of where they've been and where they're going. And so also with American Lutheranism. I know it's very complicated and very complex. There's been hundreds of different branches of Lutheranism here in this country. But if we really start looking at this carefully, it's not really that complicated.
If we're going to understand where the ELCA is today, we can't understand that apart from taking account of our history. So the story of Lutherans in America has really been a story of Lutherans moving into the mainstream of American culture and of trying to figure out over time how Lutheranism is creatively expressed, faithfully expressed in the North American cultural situation.
They had freedom, would be what they would talk about. We have freedom of religion, we have freedom to do what we want to do within the realms of the law, so we can establish our own culture here in America. So many of them talked about free and living Christians and free and living congregations in this part of the world, and then they found land so they could feed their families.
It is indeed important for newcomers to realize that because the Lutheran tradition has been special in this country, we have had, in a sense, to maintain and to work out of our unique background. Many of the newcomers are themselves persons who have experienced, maybe in one generation, the same transition from their former culture into this English-speaking United States, and have had to go through those questions of what language do we use, how do we worship, and what from our tradition is valuable that we want to continue and to contribute to this church.
When Henry Melchior Muhlenberg first stepped into this pulpit in the 1740s, he embarked on a journey that still touches our lives today. Pastor Muhlenberg played a crucial role in organizing Lutherans in America. He prepared constitutions for congregations. He helped shape the first Lutheran Synod. He spoke in his journals of church organization as the external scaffolding of the spiritual edifice. He understood that church organization was not an end in itself. Organization, he saw, was to serve the purposes of the church. The gospel was to be proclaimed. The sacraments were to be administered. The church was to be planted and nurtured. Pastor Muhlenberg and others helped those colonial Lutherans learn how to be the church in a new situation. Many of the challenges that they faced in their time are still with us in one way or another. Secularism in society, lack of biblical knowledge, religious indifference, need for churchly pastoral and lay leadership, opportunities for outreach, mobility of members, welcoming of new immigrants, care for the oppressed and the poor. The challenges did abound then, that's still true now. With courage and conviction, our forebears planted the church here in North America. The task is not finished. We have a rich heritage. We can build on that legacy. We can do so even as Lutherans in the 21st century.